tried them too, and then I had to learn that it was like a whole thing.
I'm not fond.
We're on.
We're live.
We're on.
Hello. Hello.
Yeah, we're live.
We're live. Okay, so today is December 13th. It's 3 p.m. and we're here for the Public Works Finance Committee meeting. And we have here with us Ann Zabala and Art Becky. And in the audience, we have Gina Trucio, and we also have Bill Lambert, as well as a lot of other staff. And Gary's here with us, and Sarah's ready to start with us on the first issue on our agenda today. Nope, the first issue is whether or not we approve the minutes. Yes,
We do.
we do. Okay, second issue, Sarah, you're on.
Okay, so looking at the accounts payable report for month ending November 30, 2021, total expenditures were $2,426,010. I'm sorry, that was major expenditures. Total expenditures is $2,557,468.82. Our largest expenditure was payroll, which was $1,126,113. And we have just a couple of payments to point out. We had our public safety intelligence equipment payment for $108,975. Our quarterly payment to WICCOM for $157,143.75. And then we had a police services facility construction payment number 17 in the amount of $250,227.82.
Any questions?
Nope, they looked in the normal area and as expected.
Okay. Thank you as ever
All right.
for doing such a good job on this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, now we're moving on to the Child Pedestrian Safety Grant application.
While Nate is setting us up, I will just bring to the attention that there was a typo of a date in the application announcement. So let me just correct that with you. It is on the third page of the application under number 1, application information. And in the second paragraph, it says by late fall, early winter 2021. That should be 2022.
As was stated in the CCSR correctly.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right, so I have a very brief presentation on our Child Pedestrian Safety Grant application this week. Okay. So a little bit of a history for this grant. You may remember we did actually apply for this and were successful in receiving a grant back in 2017, and that paid for some of the improvements on 3rd Street in front of the high school there. This is a new one-time funding. It's not from the surplus eliminator. It's a new House bill that was requested by Governor Little, and they are trying to make it permanent, but at this point in time, there's no concrete plans for that, or no concrete agreements for that. It is a maximum grant funding of $250,000, and one of the reasons we like this program is it doesn't require a local match. It also doesn't require any larger or more complicated specification sets that we might have to use. We can use our City of Moscow specifications. The applications for this are due December 16th. And as I presented this, yeah, it's a very tight turnaround on this one particularly.
I'm sure we have a draft of this already.
Yes, we do. And the proposed project for this includes reconfiguring the D Street and Mountain View Road intersection, and then in coordination with that, the B Street and Cleveland Street intersection to provide an additional drop-off location. The current engineer's estimate for the project is $285,000. So with a maximum grant funding of $250,000, we would need to come up with $35,000 of our own city funds for this project. We'll look a little bit at the details, and this is the large view. I've got an expanded view in the next few slides, but essentially what we're proposing to do on this D and Mountain View intersection is finish the pilot project that we started with the tubular markers. So currently we have tubular markers blocking the left turn lanes in each of these approaches. So essentially taking what was 2 lanes and narrowing it down to a single a single lane on each cardinal direction. This would essentially make that permanent with concrete, curb, gutter, sidewalk, et cetera. And it would allow us to have, through the bulb outs, we would be able to have 10-foot pedestrian curb behind the walk there. So a little bit of detail on the north side. You can see some of these numbers are a little hard to read, so I'll just let you know we are proposing 5-foot bike lanes on each side and 12-foot travel lanes. So that would get us our 34-foot width that we have there. And that would, so we would have through bike lanes that would extend. The original concept proposed having a mixing lane where we'd put the bikes up onto the sidewalk. And instead, we decided to go with these through lanes here. So, and then similar thing on the south, you can see we've created a little bit of a carve out for the smart transit to pull out for the bus shelter there. And that will provide a little protection for them and for passengers as they're loading. Apologies, that's supposed to say B Street. I thought I had changed that. That happened to me at the Transportation Commission too. So here we have the unused spur of Cleveland Street that dead ends at Euler Field here. And all we're proposing doing is essentially abandoning that as a street, continuing the curb and gutter straight through that intersection and turning this into a T intersection. And this will have vegetation and some benches to facilitate drop off. And essentially this would just extend the curb that parents are currently using to drop off and would make a simpler situation there. That's all I had on that. And
So
if there are any.
backwards,
Yes.
go back to the previous one, there's no designated extra space for the parents to park their car when they're dropping their kid off, they just drop them off and go, right?
Yes, so we would, and one of the things that we've been discussing with streets is how we would sign this to make sure that it's very clear that it is a loading zone, because what we're trying to avoid is what currently happens now, is you have some people queuing up here in front of the driveway, and then essentially a lot of people tend to queue up right here in the pedestrian pathway. So by providing this extra space here, we're allowing, 2 to 3 additional cars worth of length is what we're hoping.
Okay, so if I understand it correctly, the street is not gonna end exactly where the sidewalk is currently on each side of it. You'll be pushed back, so there'll be some space for a car to pull over to drop somebody off, is that right? I'm trying to see, there's 2 lines there, and I just wanna make sure there's actually 2.
So the red line here is a sidewalk. So the proposed plan is to extend just straight from the existing curb, not to bulb in. So there was some concern with how parents would essentially look at that when they're going to pull in, because what we have right now is people kind of stacking on each other. And so when you have those bulbs, sometimes that exacerbates that problem.
Yeah, it makes sense.
So in working with Aaron and Helen and the folks from the Safe Routes to School, we presented this at the, the annual Safe Routes to School meeting that we had a couple of weeks ago, and had since had a little more conversation with Dr. Bailey, Superintendent Bailey, and Helen and Aaron, and they'll be working with us to let parents know that this is a drop-off area. It's not pick up and wait. This is providing some protection, and this will allow the greatest flow of traffic in a safe area. So we'll have it signed, and it'll be a safe waiting area for kids too, for their parents to pick them up. And I think we talked about maybe having a bike rack there and some benches and things. So this will also keep, a lot of times you'll see cars that are just pulled in straight right there. And they park on the path sometimes. So this is a good way to protect the end of the, have a little pocket park at the end of that path for Euler Field. And potentially too, now that we'll be putting out information through the PTA and the school district and Safe Routes to School, parents will maybe move toward using this and not go through the D Street and Mountain View. So, lessen some of that congestion. But then this will also be a designated area with the crosswalks too. And also in support of that, Safe Routes to School folks were very happy, and Dr. Bailey was, with leaving the current test configuration the way it is. felt it was a lot safer situation for the crossing guards and that type of thing. So, they're happy to see that happening. And this all still falls within the Safe Routes to School maps and plans that they have, so those will get updated also. And so we'll be working with them in partnership. We've also spoken to Ben Amon at SMART, and he's glad to see this too, because the traffic at school time when he's coming down with the buses or his dial-a-ride folks, it's just much easier for them when there's designated areas and the kids know what to do and the parents know what to do. Sometimes the kids will wait at the bus stop for their parents. Yeah, at the public bus stop, and or at the public transit bus stop, I didn't know that, and he's had times, he said that he hasn't been able to pull in with his bus because there's kids getting in and out of their cars, so that was something I hadn't, so I don't know if we maybe want to do a little more PR on that, but, so this application's been widely accepted, and people are encouraged and are wishing, are glad that it'll be being taken care of next year, and this isn't one of those projects that waits 2 years before we can actually construct it. So it falls in line with all of the prior projects. It's an extension of the existing project, so it's the next step. So I think it's a well-supported application and follows the plan that we've built and stayed with over the years.
You said that Cleveland Street extension to the north there, that will be retained by the city, it's not being vacated and
It's not
given?
being vacated.
Okay.
It will just remove the asphalt and return it to, like, grass.
Okay, so has Parks been consulted on this, since they'll have maintenance responsibilities for it?
I have not talked to Parks about
Probably need to
this.
do that.
So my other question is, have you contacted the neighbors on each side of that, on the south side of the street, so that they know that it's going to become more of a space where people will be dropping their kids off?
We would wait to see if our application is actually approved before we would do that.
Okay. Because I think that they would probably best to hear it from the city before they read it in the newspaper.
And we can let them know that we submitted an application.
But I think some organization would
Yeah.
probably, I mean, this looks like a great proposal. I just want to make sure that the neighbors aren't surprised. Great. Any other questions?
No question, but it was pointed out in the packet that the D in Mountain View intersection also allows for stacking of pedestrians behind the sidewalk in the intersection, which sounds really handy to have, too. When you get a big gush of students coming out, it's a place for them to stand without overflowing onto everything around them. So also, that's a benefit.
I believe the crossing guards will be quite happy to have a little
I
extra
bet they
room
will be.
there. Yep.
Yeah.
And even as a driver, it's less confusing having, you stop, you turn your blinker on, you go, and you don't have to wait,
Four-way
see.
stops are a mystery to many drivers.
Yeah.
But
So,
especially with people, the crossing guard there. I mean, like, who's going when? The drivers don't know, much less whether or not the traffic director doesn't know where it is either.
yeah, and with the turning lanes, in my head, it's like, well, who stopped first? Well, it's a little confusing when you have turning lanes.
There's 8 choices instead of 4. Yep.
So when will we know if we're successful in our grant application?
They anticipate mid-March is the award, and we would have to have the bid mid-June.
Perfect.
Sounds like we should move this right ahead
Consent
quickly.
agenda.
Okay.
We want you to get this grant out.
Thank you.
I'm glad you worked on it ahead of time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I think you're staying here, Lisa, for a while. And Bill Delnoff is coming up as well, and we are on the ARPA Small Business and Nonprofit COVID-19 Assistance Grant Program.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Bill.
Just to provide a little bit of background, as the council's aware, the federal government passed the America Rescue Act, and as part of that program, allocated funds for state and local entities to use for COVID-19 recovery purposes. And really, the identified goals and objectives in the program is to support urgent COVID-19 response efforts to continue to decrease the spread of the virus, to replace lost revenue to eligible state, local, territorial, and tribal governments, and to strengthen support for vital public services and help retain jobs, support immediate economic stabilization for households and businesses, as well as to address systemic public health and economic challenges that have contributed to an unequal impact of the pandemic. The city's allocation underneath this program is just a little over $5.5 million. And the council, and that is being dispersed into 2 payments. We received the first in June of last year, and we'll receive the second disbursement within 12 months of that date. So we should be looking forward to receiving that in June of the upcoming year, 2022. The funding that we've received does need to be allocated, or obligated, I should say, by December 31st, the end of the year 2024, and then expended by the end of the year of 2026. And for this program, obligation means an order placed for property and services and entering into contracts, subawards, and similar transactions that require payment. So it's just kind of important to highlight the fact that this funding, we will have essentially 2 years to get it obligated, and then a remaining 2 years to get it fully expended. Council held a workshop on October 25th, where the council approved the following allocation that included $750,000 for a small business and nonprofit assistance program to be created by the city, which we're here to talk about this afternoon. There was $150,000 that was allocated to an affordable housing program. Another $1 million for stormwater infrastructure that was focused primarily on necessary equipment for the starting new stormwater utility, including a jet truck, as well as a contribution to the Lily Street reconstruction project to do some stormwater work on that project as well. And that left a balance of just a little over $3.6 million to be allocated to water capital projects under the program. Staff presented a small business nonprofit assistance proposal to this committee on actually we may have gone to administrative committee on November 8th, at which time the committee expressed a desire to expand the program, especially for those nonprofits that are directly involved in social service delivery within the community. And so we had kind of had an initial project that was addressing either direct costs incurred as part of the pandemic. That could be PPE, barriers, partitions, other types of expenditures. And then we also had an operating expense reimbursement if an entity had a substantial reduction in revenues as a result of the pandemic as compared to pre-pandemic levels. But there was expressed a desire to address maybe expanded programs or new enhanced programs that are responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically for those nonprofits that are directly involved in providing certain social services to the community. And so we've gone back and kind of revised the program and brought it back to you this afternoon for your review. So really there are kind of 2 unique components to the program. There's kind of a general small business nonprofit grant program, again, that provides assistance for some direct costs and operational expenses. But then we also have what we call the Community and Social Services Nonprofit Grant Program that, again, is intended to not require that demonstration of reduction of revenues and allows for the opportunity for evidence-based interventions that are responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. So the small business nonprofit, the council has kind of seen previously, again, we did kind of scale down what we define as being small business as 50 or fewer employees. Initially, when we talked on the 8th, we were using other federal standards that had 200 employees as being the threshold, so we have reduced that down to 50. Eligible expenses underneath the program, as I mentioned, include both direct cost in responding to the pandemic, that is that personal protective equipment, barriers or partition, enhanced cleaning, COVID-19 vaccination, testing, contact tracing, and other similar expenses that are directly related to responding to the pandemic. And then we also have the operational cost, again, where they can demonstrate a substantial reduction, and this is for our standards, a 25% reduction of net income that may result from either reductions of revenues or increased expenses or cost coming from the pandemic, that they could apply for operational expenses. And those could include things such as rents, supplies, utilities, marketing, payroll expenses, including healthcare premiums. So again, being able to cover that benefit as well. So there's documentation that's required to be provided in order for us to verify the reduction of net income. So 3 years of financial statements to demonstrate that revenue reduction, current bank statements for 2021 and 2022 to date, tax returns for the last 3 years, a personal financial statement where it may be a sole proprietorship, and nonprofit organizations have the 990 forms that they would need to provide for the preceding 3 years, essentially their tax return documents for their organization. The Form W-9, as well as a disclosure regarding any assistance or they have received previously. So we don't want to be providing financial relief for expenses that they may have been reimbursed for previously. So they'd have to disclose what they've received previously for state, local, and federal assistance so that we can ensure that we are not reimbursing an expense or cost that has already been reimbursed underneath another program. The eligible expense period was defined as being 2021 through 2022 calendar years. So that's when an expense would be eligible. And then we had outlined an application process where we would, our hope is to get the program with council direction operational early next year. We'd run it for probably a 90-day time period. We'd review the applications on a first come, first served basis, and then they would be grouped together and brought forward to the council for review every 2 weeks. We'd also provide an opportunity for requests for reconsideration or provide additional information if there are any questions about the documentation that we received. Grant award limits are limited to $15,000 unless otherwise approved by the council underneath this program. So that's kind of the small business nonprofit. Then this is what we titled the Community and Social Services Nonprofit Grant Program. Again, this is funding to be made available to nonprofit organizations for the development and delivery of new or expanded service programs in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Those programs need to be consistent with the mission and purpose of the organization and need to include evidence-based intervention measures that have been demonstrated to be successful in addressing the need that they are trying to meet and be responsive to the public health emergency and the negative social and economic impacts that have come from the pandemic. There are 4 particular community service areas. The grants are limited to organizations that operate in one of these 4 areas, so they could include service to address homelessness. That's primarily emergency and transitional housing services and needs, and access to stable and affordable housing, behavioral health services, including mental health, substance misabuse treatment, crisis intervention, domestic abuse intervention and prevention programs, nutritional assistance services, including food banks, food assistance programs, and similar services provided to households in need, and then educational services for those that potentially have been disrupted during the pandemic and are behind academically. If there's a program that's there to address those students' needs, they would be eligible to apply as well. So those are kind of the 4 service areas that were identified for this specific program. Eligible entities, again, any 501c3 nonprofit organization, not strictly foundations, really it has to be a nonprofit organization providing direct assistance and services to Moscow residents. It must have a primary mission that is within one or more of the community service areas that were identified. We do note the nonprofit organization must have at least 1 employee, and the goal there was to address, those that are directly involved in the delivery of services. We've been made aware there are some concerns that there are some food banks that operate locally that don't have direct paid employees, and so we can add an exception. The council can approve award of an entity that doesn't have an employee in those instances. So certainly that's something we can modify and address in the program. The grant awards that we've identified are $25,000, depending upon available funding and program interest. We have language in there stating that we'd reserve the right to award a portion of the applicant's request. Should there be high demand, we're trying to make sure that we can distribute the funds to all of those entities in need, that we can provide that opportunity, provide partial awards, and allow the applicants to update their spending plan proposal to match that amount. We would require them to sign a grant agreement indicating that they're going to utilize those funds for the purposes identified in their application and in the spending plan that would be submitted with their application, and then we disperse those funds in a single payment. And then they'd be required to expend those funds within a 2-year time period or by the end of 2023. And again, we can potentially, our concern with all of these programs has been if there wasn't the demand that was realized or if the funds had not been expended by that time, we do want to try to make sure that they are obligated and expended by 2026. So if there were some excess funds that we could repurpose to a different use. We are trying to get those funds kind of committed and expended in that time period. And then essentially, any portion of the grant funds that are not expended would be returned to the city essentially by the end of January 2024. That then gives us essentially the remaining 11 months of the year to repurpose, reallocate, and recommit those, obligate those funds for expenditure by the end of 2026. We are noting that they would be required to provide a grant report that would be any documentation of the expenditure to ensure that that was done in compliance with the grant agreement and their spending plan that they submitted as well. For both of these programs, we are recommending establishment of a review committee. So it'd be a 3-member review committee of city staff. I mean, certainly Lisa as grants manager, likely the finance director, and another staff member that would review the applications and make recommendations to the city council. The council would be the entity that would be the final approving body. So we bring a number of applications to you for review and for final approval. Funds then, we would intend to be dispersed within 30 days of that award approval. And then again, we would have that reporting requirement to ensure that the funds were used in accordance with the grant program and any other ARPA obligations. Program would be administered by the Grants Division with assistance with the Finance Department. So that's what we are proposing. So we have prepared that draft resolution for your consideration, and we'd be happy to hear any questions or direction you'd have this afternoon.
I have a bunch, so
Right,
if
so
anybody
I-
wants to go.
I've got one. Just, does the draft include the language that allows for the exemption of having an employee in some of the nonprofits?
No, that was a concern
That'll be
we
inserted.
realized today, so we can make that modification and have that available for the draft that we, in the council's packet, if you wish to advance it to the council on the 20th.
Yes, actually, that was a big concern of mine, and so I think that that's really helpful to have that taken out, just so the record shows is that, you know, the food bank has never had an employee, and Linda Nichols donates about 40 hours a week, and has for like the last 30 years. The Inland Oasis actually is getting their first employee at the beginning of this year, and that person will get 15 hours a week. And so it doesn't seem to be that would be a priority, like a criteria that we should keep in there, or some way to work around it. So that,
And the thought would be to retain it, but allow the council's approval to not require that obligation.
okay,
So it would just be that we would have the employee unless otherwise approved by the council.
okay.
And I think maybe we would say, could you provide a list of the number of volunteers that you have to provide your services? And then we would bring that forward.
Okay. And also an idea of just who manages it.
Right,
I mean, so that it's not just kind of a hopscotch around here, there's something specific.
right. I
that
think
says-
we would ask for that to be in the outline of the spending plan, is how that would work.
Okay.
I'll just launch in then if you didn't have anything else, Maureen.
Go ahead.
So when we refer to the most recent pre-pandemic fiscal year, are we referring to the city's fiscal year?
No, the entity's fiscal year.
Okay, their fiscal year.
Yes, correct.
Gotcha. And I'm curious what you envision for the personal finance statement that we're asking for.
So that would be for an organization that is usually a sole proprietor, and that's similar to any other program I've managed in the past. It's basically their Schedule C, but it would be an updated version of that. So it's just name, address, assets, liabilities, so that you can look at the income and the debt.
Great, okay.
I have another question, let me just pop
Yeah,
in.
go for it.
The other question is, maybe I was mistaken with what you were saying, Bill, but it looks to me like, is our goal to try and allocate some funds to everybody who applies, or to prioritize the severity of the need in terms of allocating our money?
So for the social, we haven't developed a prioritization for the first category, the small business nonprofit. It was really first come, first serve.
Right.
I think what we talked about, the reserving the right for a partial award for the social service nonprofits was if there was an overwhelming, and we wanted to make sure that we could allocate funding across all of those service areas, that we reserve that right to review those and to make partial awards if necessary, if we were encountering funding limitations. So it was just providing the statement that we reserve the right to give a partial award if that is deemed necessary.
But with the ultimate goal of funding everyone that applies?
I think the ultimate goal would be to fund everyone that applies. I guess the question just becomes, what is that demand compared to funding that has been allocated to this program?
I anticipate that maybe some people that apply, what they're requesting money for may be outside of the areas that we can fund, and that will probably be the question that we'll have to look at.
I'm curious why the later months, March through December of 2020, are not considered as an eligible time period.
I think, that's when most of the other federal assistance programs were in existence. So we just, reaching back that far was something that we just felt, starting with the 2021, we're already reaching back 12 months for eligible expenses. So that was kind of where we drew the line. If the council would like to explore pushing that eligible expense period back farther, we could. It just seemed to be at some point, we're already reaching back a year. Going back to reimbursed expenses from 2 years ago seemed to be, a
And
bit.
also the first few months of 2020 where everything was operating normally. And so how do you show the same impact at that point? So I think going to 2021 makes more sense in terms of documentation, as well as the total impact that COVID might have had on a particular entity.
I understand the rationale. I just also think there was probably, for a lot of entities, a ton of money spent right at the beginning in terms of different things that they might need for setup, for safety and everything else. So I was curious about that. And then there's two standouts for me when it says, unless approved by the city council. So any applications over 15,000 or anything that falls under the community service areas that's not quite there for a different application. What do you envision as the process? Is it similar to something where, let's say the review committee deems that maybe it's not, and then it's appealed and goes up to us, or do you just pass it directly onto the council? How do you imagine that functioning?
So for the actual grant awards, if somebody makes a request in excess of the 15,000, let's say they make a request underneath the small business program for 25,000, we make a recommendation that the award be limited to the 15,000 that was set forth in the resolution. The council then, if you felt the need was extraordinary and felt that you wish to fund it up to that level, would have that ability to do so. So I don't know that you would see staff making a recommendation to fund an award greater than an amount, but the council reserves that right and that authority to do so should you see that the need was extraordinary, you felt that it should be made.
So how would we know an application of that amount had been received?
It'll come in the full packet. So you'll receive the funding request, you'll receive the committee's review and recommendation. So all of that material will be in your packet when it gets to you for final approval.
Great. I think those were all my questions. I had a couple small other things to point out. So I think the review committee sounds great. I think we could explore maybe specifying that it will be staff. If you just read review committee, I thought that might be something that would be helpful. And then in the language of the whereases, so there's two that sort of address the rationale. There's one about small business, but then there's also one about the pandemic's impacts. Specifically, it talks about behavioral health. It doesn't really, to me, kind of encompass the other areas that we're intending to fund. I'd be interested in seeing that reworked a little bit or an additional one added.
Right here.
Can you give me the number that page you're on?
Yeah.
The top.
22.
Page, yeah. I see what you're saying, the wording, where we expand further on substance abuse or those types of things, the mental health.
And these are just the recitation statements. It really is just speaking to the need for the program.
Yeah.
These were statements directly out of the America Rescue Plan Act. So there's a number of recitations at the beginning of that act that kind of document the impact of the pandemic. We can certainly go back. And you were looking for specifically for what area for us to?
It just seems to not, if you read it, it doesn't necessarily feel like it encompasses the other areas.
So, Ann, would it satisfy you if, in fact, they inserted there a whereas that included the section there that says food insecurity, housing insecurity, in the overall language of the application, it kind of has that in there. So if we had a whereas in there, would that satisfy you?
Yeah. Or I think even just expanding on this one, and other social and community resources.
And
such
address the
as-
housing and
Yeah.
housing security and housing food security. Sure, we can do
Yeah.
that. We can
And
add
then
that.
the last one, just that, for me, reading it, it wasn't clear that it was the applicant's fiscal year.
Sure.
I would be interested in a little tweak there too. But
Okay.
overall, I thought this looked really great. I appreciate all the work that went into it, and I feel really good about how it's laid out.
Well, we can easily make those modifications and have it to you for review at the council meeting.
All right, thank you so much.
That'll be regular agenda.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on to the next one. First of all, I just want to say, as you're sitting here with, on your second one, how much work it is to be the grants person right now when there's granting opportunities out there and staying on top of it and keeping us informed of those. Okay, then the next one. Well, I don't think you get to, oh, these are the Affordable Home Ownership Grant Program Awards.
Many moons ago in my prior life, I worked on a program, I managed an SBA small loan program that was similar to this, and there were also grant funds that went with it, so I have a visual of, looking at these applications must be very similar to that.
And aside, just let me put a comment on that, because I know that we came up the last time with a grant application, and it says, although they have a maximum, you're like, we've been told this is the amount that we want to go for. And so I fact that we don't get kicked out because we asked for the maximum, and there's difference in terms of the grants, and I appreciate that, because it would be unfortunate if they said this is the maximum, but they're never going to give that out, and they're going to deny it right off the bat. So I'm glad you
Right.
know that difference.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So earlier this year, the council approved by resolution of 2021-22 the creation of a affordable home ownership grant program. So that was intended, so the council, I guess in the upcoming, the 2022 fiscal year, the mayor's budget came forward to the council with an allocation of $50,000 that would be made available to support the development of affordable housing within the community. Through the budget process, I ended up getting reduced down to $30,000, as $20,000 was reallocated to address climate change issues facing the community. So that is the funding that currently is in place, and we needed to establish a program by which those funds would then be distributed toward the development of affordable housing. So that program was then formalized and adopted by resolution earlier this year. Essentially, it made funding available to nonprofit entities whose primary mission and purpose is the development of affordable housing within Moscow. The grant program highlighted that the funding could be utilized for the purposes of either construction of new housing, and that could be detached single-family, attached single-family, could be even condominium, as long as there are home ownership opportunities, and indicated that the allocation that would be made available per housing unit was $10,000 per housing unit, unless otherwise approved by the council. Subsequent to the adoption of that resolution and that program, the council chose to allocate $150,000 from the ARPA funding to affordable housing development. And so once the program was adopted, we received applications from both Habitat for Humanity and the Moscow Affordable Housing Trust. The Moscow Affordable Housing Trust was asking for 5 housing units, an allocation for 5 housing units, and the Habitat for Humanity was requesting 1. So both of those entities would meet the requirements as established in the Affordable Housing Grant Program. And in order, and we kind of discussed this briefly during the earlier review of the Affordable Housing Program, that in light of the potential ARPA funding, the city may be available to increase that allocation to $20,000 per housing unit rather than 10, in light of the exceptional construction cost market that we're currently in today, as well as to try to help allocate those ARPA funds. As we discussed previously underneath the Small Business Grant Program, we do need to have those obligated by the end of '24 and expended by '26. So in consideration of the 6 requests that were received, we reviewed the proposals, all the documentation that was required to be submitted, and they all appear to be eligible to receive the funding. And so it was staff's recommendation that we grant the request from both entities, but in the amount of $20,000 per housing unit rather than the $10,000 adopted underneath the resolution. So the council does have that authority. The initial thought was to utilize the $30,000 that The council had appropriated for the program this year, and then we would supplement the remaining 90,000 from the ARP, from the 150,000 of ARPA funds. That's the program. When it was proposed to the council for consideration with the ARPA program, it was described as that the city would likely allocate or intended to allocate 50,000 per year, and then we'd add 50,000 of the ARPA funds to that per year for a $100,000 allocation for the upcoming 3 years to support development of housing. There is a time lag. It does take time for both Habitat and the Housing Trust to actually get housing units, property secured, homes built, and then they have to, underneath the program, this is a reimbursement basis, so the house has to meet certain affordability standards, the buyer has to meet certain income standards, and those are verified upon the closing of the sale of the home, and then we reimburse them, whatever the allocation is to the nonprofit housing developer. So in order to try to get the money in the pipeline, to get the housing units constructed, we are recommending to increase that allocation to 20,000 per housing unit. With that, I think we'd be happy to answer any questions that the committee might have.
And I know you have a question.
So-
Didn't you have a question?
Oh, sure, but go for it. Yeah,
Oh.
thank you, though.
I was just going to say, so in my home checkbook-oriented outlook on some of the budgety bits, we're essentially spending more in the beginning out of the ARPA monies supplemented by this year's $30,000, which would leave us with, $60,000 in the ARPA monies, plus any additional at $50,000 a year that we're thinking supplement to that for the next couple of years.
In FY '23, whatever the council decides to appropriate to the funding, so the ARPA funding would be placed into a capital accumulation line item, would stay there for the purposes of this program, and then during the formation of the 2023 budget, whatever the mayor and the council decide to appropriate would be added to that 60,000, and then that would be available beginning essentially in October 1 of 2022. As we turn the fiscal year, that's when we intend to make the funding available. So as we move into that time period, into the FY '23 budget, that funding would be available for applications.
So it sounds like it's, given the time lag with all of the qualifying bits of having to have the house built already and stuff like that, for this to actually get T spending up front sounds like a wise thing to do if we're going to obligate the funds in time to have them used.
That raises the question of whether or not we should make it the whole allocation out of ARPA funds and then just keep rolling over the 30,000 for the next couple of years until we need that money. And so I'm not sure, can you explain why one is better than the other?
I think that certainly would be an option. We presented it in this fashion because this is the way that was described to the council when the council made the appropriation from the ARPA funds towards affordable housing. It was always presented as being, we would take a portion of it, we would match that with a city's budgeted funds, and that would be available over the next 3 years. If the council would prefer to make the entire 120 allocation out of ARPA funds, we could certainly do that. The 30,000 would end up, we move the 30,000 into that capital accumulation fund. And then we would have 30,000 left over from the ARPA funds that would end there, and we would end up at the same amount. We would pre-obligate some of the ARPA funds earlier, which there's probably some advantages to doing that. It just had always been presented that this was going to be contributed 50,000 per year to kind of have a more steady funding stream for that program. But
My own sense is that since they have such a tight timeline, I mean, to get funds allocated and then expended during this period of time seems to me to be somewhat of a short time frame. And so if somebody coming in and they applied, they said, we know you'll get X number, I guess it's like X number of dollars this year and next year, just because the funding doesn't come in until June of 2022, the second payment, right? But if you give people notice, my biggest concern is I want to make sure that those who in fact are going to get funds know that they have those funds and they have a very limited amount of time. And the longer they have to be able to get ready to spend that money and to get the projects done seems advantageous.
And I don't think it'll necessarily be difficult. So for this, a grant award, we would view that as being an obligation. We'd have until the end of '26 for those funds to be fully expended. It'd be best, it'd probably be preferable for the city to have it obligated and expended well in advance of that, so we don't run the risk of having a grant award or a commitment. They have the 24 months to build the home and close on the home with a qualifying buyer. There could be some moderate risk that an allocation or award made in '24 may not close with a qualifying buyer by the end of '26, and there could be a risk that some of that money would maybe necessarily be required to be returned back to the feds if that would be the case. So there are some advantages to ensuring that the funding that has the obligation and expenditure timeline is committed earlier rather than later, and the city could reserve its $30,000 that does not have those requirements for a later contribution.
But, okay, so I have a question about the trust fund, and that is, do they not build it and set it up until they have a buyer? Or don't they build it and then they get a buyer? I mean, what order does that come in?
Correct. They will get funding to build typically 4 to 5 homes from IHFA that provides the construction loan financing. So they will build it, and then they will find a qualifying buyer. So they don't wait to get a qualifying buyer before they build the home, correct?
And is there any concern, after talking to Nels, whether or not there's going to be some concern as to whether or not they're going to be able to get 5 houses built or be within the timeframe?
I don't think so. They are currently looking at modular homes. So these are not mobile or manufactured, but essentially factory-built housing that's placed on a permanent foundation as a way of addressing and helping with affordability. Even though it's per square foot, it is not dramatically less expensive, but you can get guaranteed production and delivery dates, which in this market is challenging to get contractors who are very busy in many other areas. So that appears to be a strategy that the trust is exploring at this time to try to address that question. They have a track record of developing housing, have built 3 townhomes just in the area near where their Paradise Valley View subdivision is, where we expect they will use this allocation to. So I think we're confident they'll find a way to get those housing units constructed.
One other one, dealing with the accounting thing, we get 2 draws on the ARPA funds by expending more of this $150,000 we've allocated. Is that just an exercise in accounting, moving things around than it is saying, oh, 75 here and 75 there?
Well, we don't actually expend this until the home is constructed and closed with a qualifying buyer. So we will receive
thing
the
in
second tranche of funding before we see any request for actual payment. What the entities will receive now is a letter of grant award that lets them know they can rely that if they meet the conditions of the program, that they construct and close the house within 24 months with a qualifying buyer, that essentially they can expect to have the city reimburse them that award. And so we won't see that expense until we receive that second tranche of funding.
I have a question too. I thought we agreed to, like, this year was going to be 30,000 between, that housing was going to be 30,000 and climate change was going to be 20. My question is, it appears to me that this looks like we are committing on, into the future, well, past that, for these funds. And I have some kind of apprehension about deciding, I mean, although housing is a huge issue for us, and particularly it's one for me too, having it drafted as if we're going to have this ad infinitum.
And, I mean, and that is what the resolution the council passed says, is that, and again, it was.
When I saw it again the second time,
It was
I
a
looked at it
goal,
differently.
right, it was a goal. It didn't say that the council would, and it's a resolution, which is a policy statement and can be amended in the future, but that was what was in the resolution that the council passed earlier this year.
Okay.
I think the council will be well advised that it is one of your major challenge areas of your strategic plan. So I don't think, as Bill indicated, depending on what fiscal challenges you're facing in a particular year, it's a statement of, we'd like to do this, but certainly council is free to change that policy if they so desire based on circumstances at the time.
Ann, do you have any questions?
Yeah, so I love that we have 2 entities eligible for this, but I still don't understand Habitat's recapture or retention mechanism. Have they put one in place that makes them a
They're
candidate?
working on it right now.
Okay.
And so they'll have to provide evidence of that prior to getting reimbursed. So their letter, they understand the They understand the mechanism, either recapture or retention. They are fully committed to complying to that. And they've indicated that there are other habitat chapters that do that today. And usually it's a resale formula and it's a retention method. And so they are working on that, and they say they'll have that in place prior to starting construction of this next home.
Great. That was all I had.
Okay.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. It has to go on the agenda.
Sam, would you like that on consent or regular?
Regular, please.
Regular, yeah. It has to go on the regular.
So I have
Thank
no
you.
changes,
Thank you.
correct?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much.
Thank you.
The next issue on the agenda is the PMRA Terminal Financing Proposal and Resolution. Gary Reedner is on.
Thank you, ma'am. What you have before you today is the follow-up on the Pullman Moscow Regional Airport Terminal Project. As you recall, on November 8th, council held a workshop where it was discussed the proposal for the terminal project. We had representatives of Mead and Hunt and the executive director of the PMRA, Tony Bean, presented to council. Essentially, they presented a budget or a project that had been designated, excuse me, got a frog in my throat, had been designated by the Pullman Moscow Regional Airport Board as bring a project in that had $10 million of local match, kind of mirroring what they'd done for the airport runway realignment project. Local match, of course, as they explained that night, is a little bit different than for the runway because very little, or I shouldn't say that, not a large percentage of the terminal will be subject to FAA eligible project. So they came in and said, okay, if we can raise $10 million locally, that the project, which then would be around $43 million instead of the approximately $52,500,000 that it had originally been estimated. So what you have before you today is a way for the city of Moscow, as one of the FAA sponsors of the airport, to fund that. We followed the same model that we did, so council on the 8th indicated that they would do so if there were certain conditions met, up to $2 million. The first, that sufficient local funding was identified to meet current estimates for the terminal project. So in other words, if $10 million was the local participation, there had to be a certainty that that $10 million could be raised. Secondly, that Moscow's participation would not exceed that of Pullman's, which is our other co-sponsor on the airport. 3, that Moscow be allowed to phase its participation, which is how we made the runway realignment project work. And lastly, that the city of Pullman would agree to share tax revenues generated by properties on the airport site or in an impact area around the airport. The mayor then sent a letter to Mayor Glenn Johnson, which I put in a copy in the packet, laying out those, the conditions of the council's participation, and indicated that if Pullman would agree to those, that we would then move forward. I went to the city of Pullman's council meeting approximately 2 weeks ago where it was presented, and they indicated that they would participate up to $2 million as well, and would be able to cash flow the project in allowing us to phase our participation. They did not talk about the tax revenue sharing arrangement, in the airport property and around the impact area of the airport. Further inquiry in discussing it with City Administrator Mike Urban. He had discussions with Mayor Johnson. As you also know, we have a request under our current operating agreement for the airport that half of the land and fixtures of the airport will be transferred to the city of Moscow upon our request. Council authorized to move forward with that request. I sent a letter to Mayor Johnson indicating that the city wished to exercise that option. Right now, Pullman City Attorney Laura McAloon is working on that project. The property, of course, is in the city of Pullman's name. I'm told there are between 50 and 60 separate parcels on the airport, so they either need to develop a quick claim deed for each of those parcels, or they need to consolidate in some way, which is a job, since I will not be here to help, will fall to our city attorney. Not that she wouldn't have done it anyway, but she'll be working with Ms. McAloon to try and facilitate that. So that will take some time. Just by an aside, the city attorney and I will be traveling to Laura's office, and we'll meet with her and transition that later in the month. So, which leaves us to the resolution, the draft resolution that you have in your packet. It's very similar to the resolution that was developed for the Runway Realignment Project. Numbers have changed, of course. Our participation for the Runway Realignment was $2.5 million. This one is for $2 million. It contains all of the conditions that the council indicated that they would participate subject to, and including the phase development. Also, that it is still conditional in the resolution that Pullman agreed to share those tax revenues, tax revenue sharing arrangement. So, leaves us to the financing. How do we do this? I put in your packet a spreadsheet that contains two different segments. The first segment is, the top segment, I should say, is the proposal that I am advocating for you today. The lower spreadsheet segment, it shows how we finance the Runway Realignment Project. The Runway Realignment Project was done in two different phases. The first phase was an initial payment was paid from the general fund, which essentially represented 1/5 of the total obligation. And subsequent payments of $500,000 over the next 4 years were made through interfund borrowing, which essentially is an investment vehicle by which the city, by resolution, the council authorized borrowing funds from enterprise fund accumulation, or payroll service fund, which is not an enterprise fund, was also one of the funds that was utilized. And essentially what it is that money is borrowed, and I believe it was 2.5% was paid on the Runway Realignment Project. Since that time, interest rates have dropped, so it is 1.2% on the instant case. Now, how that is paid for, the money is borrowed. Back in 2015, council authorized accessing $216,705 of foregone taxes. And all that was taxes that were authorized but were not taken. They're only foregone once. Once you take them, they become part of your general fund tax revenue. So you'll see there are two orange bands in these segments, just to show that those funds that were taken, they're not foregone anymore because we're getting them every year, but they are earmarked, if you will, to amortize this debt. So you utilize that amount of funding, and then we borrowed the balance to make $500,000 from the enterprise fund, or the accumulation, to make our full $500,000 payment. Then at the end of the segment, the 4 years, we started paying those funds back. So on the Runway Realignment Project, the last payment made to those enterprise funds will be in fiscal year 2023. We would propose that for the obligation for the terminal project, we follow exactly the same pattern. We have $666,667, which the council could make available in fiscal year 22, the current fiscal year, which means prior to September 30th of 2022. That funding is part of unanticipated fund balance, as I've explained to the council before. When the council sets a budget, they have appropriations which have been authorized and expenditures that have been authorized. If we do our job right and conditions are right, we hopefully will spend less than revenues we take in. So even though they could have been expended, they weren't expended, leaving what we call unanticipated fund balance. When the end of the year is closed, we know how much money we took in that we did not expend, and typically that funding goes into the capital accounts for the council then to appropriate the following year or a subsequent year. In this case, council could choose to utilize that funding to make the first payment on this obligation. If they did so, immediately 1/3 of the obligation would be taken care of. You'll notice under the top segment, there is no payment to the city of Pullman on the terminal project for 2023, that being the same year that we're making our final payment on runway realignment. Then in FY '24 and '25, or either or, council would then budget that amount of money to go back or to go over to the city of Pullman that would entirely retire our obligation. Now, the good thing about this program is that we're looking into the future somewhat, but this program has all the flexibility for the current city administration, council, and finance director to determine that there may be some other plan. It may be that another program comes up, or maybe there will be unanticipated fund balance in the future that council might want to tap instead of borrowing from these funds. So that decision can be made 2 years from now. It does not need to be made today. This is merely a model. What we'd like to do is to have council authorized to use that unanticipated fund balance. That also reduces Pullman's cash flow obligation, which also assists. And if council will authorize doing that, then the resolution allows the flexibility for that repayment plan.
Do we have any idea how much money we will, assuming that Pullman agrees to the shared tax revenue? Do we have any idea how much that is, and would that money go into helping pay back our debt?
No, I don't know how much it would be. I don't know what taxes are generated from within the airport or without the airport. They have taxing districts just as we do. We're not asking that Whitman County or any other taxing district that gets a cut of those taxes would share with us. We're just looking as equal partners in the airport and having paid the same amount as the city of Pullman has for the airport, that we would share those revenues, but I don't know how much those are. They would come to the city as in the form of a payment, which would go into the general fund, and you could allocate it for whatever you wanted to.
Which is the same thing, for instance, if we get enough money to make the parking lot, the parking lots can actually make money, and that would come back into our general fund.
No, monies that are generated by the airport, I'm talking about revenues, profit, whatever you want to call it, has to stay with the airport. It's not a profit center for the cities that are sponsors. I'm talking about any funds that are paid, any money that is paid for property or sales tax generated. That money isn't FAA money or FAA obligated money. That is paid to the local government jurisdiction.
Okay. It's unfortunate they can't help pay off the debt. I just want to point that out.
The FAA is fairly clear about that, and the attorneys that we hired to assist us with the property transfer made it very clear to us that those funds are not eligible to help us.
I think it's a pretty clear, as straightforward as it could be, way to facilitate this transfer without incurring a lot of pain in other areas of the budget.
I don't know what the other options are. I mean, you're heading that direction, I'm not sure, but I still think it should go onto the full agenda.
You bet.
Ann, did you have anything to say?
Nope.
Okay.
I agree.
Okay, we'll bring it to the regular agenda as well. Okay,
Okay, so we're 3 minutes and 35 seconds over. So if I don't hear, ready to adjourn?
Let's
Any
go.
other issues? Let's go.
Turn it over to the admin folks.